Welcome to the EdRed Podcast, a podcast discussing important issues impacting Illinois public education and the action being taken to address them. Each month, a new episode will be released featuring education experts.
The EdRed Podcast is co-hosted by Bridget Peach and Arabette Hernandez of EdRed.
Who is EdRed and why does it matter? Join us for a conversation discussing the 52-year history of EdRed, featuring Superintendent of Maine 207, Dr. Ken Wallace. As a former EdRed Executive Board member and the superintendent of a founding district, Dr. Wallace will take us down memory lane and share why EdRed is an effective, valuable advocacy organization. Thank you so much for joining us today. To kick us off, please take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background and your history with EdRed.
All right. Well, first of all, Arabette and Bridget, thank you so much for having me on the very first EdRed podcast, the first of what I'm sure with the two of you will be the first of many, many, many to come. So that's cool. I'm totally honored to be a part of that. As you said, I'm the superintendent at Maine Township High School District 207. I'm in my 15th and final year in that capacity, but 19th with the district. I started at Maine in 2005 as the assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction, and then was fortunate enough to be hired from within the district. First superintendent actually hired from within the district in 2009, and have just had the most wonderful career here that anybody could ever have imagined. Back in 2005, our offices were over at Maine South, and I would come in the back door right past Erica Lindley's office. Erica at that time was the administrative assistant, and I got to know Erica, and Erica was great in that as things would come up, she would say, "Hey, Ken, what do you think about this? What do you think about that?" And it helped me learn actually early on, because I had to lean into some issues and think about them a little bit differently. So EdRed was a part of the fabric here because we'd been the fiscal agent and the offices were here, and they felt like, part of our team. And so it just was really, really fun and fascinating to have. I realize now better than I did then what an advantage it was for us to have EdRed as a part of our District 207 community.
And then, so kind of speaking onto that a little bit more, as you mentioned, EdRed and Maine 207 have always had a relationship. Can you just give us a little bit more of that history and what that really entails between them two?
So near as we can tell by the documents, there was an interest among some of the local high school superintendents. I think part of it was based on actually the adoption of the Illinois Constitution in 1970, and some of the tenets of that, and then some of the school code, which appear to, based on early documents, provide the basis for school districts to enter into these agreements that allowed for the inception of EdRed, which means that EdRed certainly has to be, if not the first, certainly one of the first advocacy organizations formed in Illinois like this. And I think that's a really cool thing. But I think it's like anything else where folks, probably there was some legislation passed that got everybody rankled, and someone said, we got to do something about that. What can we do? And so turns out, Robin Schwartz, the law firm, was in existence then, and they provided the early legal basis for the foundation of EdRed. And as they say, the rest is history. And in looking through the documents, one of the things that happened, there were about 15 high school districts in Cook County and DuPage County and Lake County that were a part of the inception. But the first legal basis opinion was that we couldn't exclude elementary districts. And so the partnership, the law actually required the participation, the allowed participation of the elementary districts as well. So I think that set the foundation for the wonderful organization that we have today.
It's really cool to see Robin Schwartz on those early documents, especially since they're currently one of our sponsors. We have that close partnership that's over 50 years strong, which is really cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Since you've been involved with EdRed for a while and going back beyond just your superintendency, but when you were first with Maine, looking back over that time, what are some of the most impactful advocacy actions or legislation that EdRed has worked on, and why?
So, and there have been many. There have been many, 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 and I have learned so much. I just finished a 7-year term as an executive board member, and I truly learned a lot in that time and in that role. But probably, if you think of, monumental historic things, the evidence-based funding model was actually written by two Ed Red board members, Brian Battle and Bob Spatz. Brian was at Barrington. Bob Spatz was at the Oak Park River Forest Elementary District 97. Bob worked for the University of Chicago, a psychometrician, just a really brilliant guy. Brian was I think a Harvard grad, brilliant in his own right. Two of the smartest people that I've ever known. And at that time, there was a movement in the state to really come up with an evidence-based funding model, which was greatly needed. Illinois is a really vast and incredibly diverse state. And so there was a push to do that. People were not able to figure it out. Well, Bob and Brian worked diligently on it and figured it out. I was actually privileged on a couple of occasions to actually get to see the first sort of public beta testing. And that happened in Ed Red meetings, in Ed Red board meetings. We rolled it out and got to look at it, gave feedback. I remember telling Brian Battle, your numbers are off for high school districts in terms of the cost basis for our employees. And in any event, they figured out the model now. And then those guys were kind enough to share that with the folks at ISA and ISB. And it wasn't long after that model became the public-facing model that was eventually adopted and signed into law as EBF. History should note that the original model was written by two board members of Ed Red back in the day. And those guys actually have not gotten a lot of credit for what they've done, and they should, because if not for them, we certainly wouldn't have probably had a model that we could roll out. Now, I think both of them would tell you this, but it's been subsequently used in a way that it wasn't necessarily designed for. But that's a little bit more in the weeds, and hopefully you can get Brian and Bob to get on and talk a little bit more about that. But they're two just brilliant guys. And frankly, I think what's really cool about Brian and Bob, and I can say this having known a lot of board members in my time on Ed Red, and even when I wasn't a board member, Ed Red has just always been privileged to, first of all, represent tremendous districts, have really good, smart superintendents, have really good, smart board members who are true public servants. And I think EBF is a big piece of that. More recently, obviously, I was fortunate to work on a couple of bills, one around dual credit partnerships and credit counting, and then just this past legislative session on the data sharing agreement. Those both got passed unanimously in the House and Senate. So as you know, I retired undefeated at Ed Red, People's Champion. One signed into law by a Republican governor, one signed into law by a Democratic governor, so totally bipartisan. But I think the thing that I learned the most in that time is when we really, I think, got better about partnering with Lend and LUDA and the other organizations, the high school district organizations. And when I saw us come together and broaden that advocacy footprint, there's really nothing that we can't do when we do that. And it's more important than ever probably do that. But again, those particular things, I think EBF is always going to be a thing that Ed Red should point to. But I know there's so many things that Ed Red has done successfully and led on that we're proud of, and it's important that our districts understand how important the work that we do is.
Yes, definitely undefeated for you. That's great. I just wanted to take a moment and acknowledge that the partners that Ken is referring to is LUDA, the Large Unit District Association, LEN, which is the Legislative Education Network of DuPage, and SCOPE. Bridget, I'm going to ask you to help me out with that one.
SCOPE represents the South Cook school districts.
And then the high school district obviously is
Yes.
the high school district organization. One could argue that Ed Red was the original high school district organization, but I'm sure the high school district organization might take issue with that.
Especially geographically, because IHSDO represents from, tip to tail of Illinois, and we focus on the northwest suburbs. But all good information. I know one of the other topics that you worked and engaged on was Invest in Kids and ending that, and being the first state in Illinois. You were the one who reached out to us once that was, firmly, planning to sunset, that we were the first state in the union to roll back that kind of program. And I think that's really historical. Obviously, once again, we worked with a lot of partners on that issue, but definitely something that we're proud of, especially in the landscape of the United States.
And really invest in kids, and Bridget and Arabette, I give you a lot of credit for that. I think your work in that. I remember when we had the original conversation about should we pursue that, and I don't think there was any doubt about how I felt about it. But I think, understanding the history of public education, the significance of that particular movement, which was born out of really the worst impulses and instincts of those who would criticize and try to undermine public education. It gets to the very core of why organizations like EdRed are so essential and so important. People can say anything they want to say about Illinois, but as a transplanted Illinoisan from Indiana that has done so much to undermine public education, in fact, sort of wrote the blueprint that a lot of states have tried to follow. Invest in Kids really was a blueprint coming out of Indiana. And the governor at that time hired the chief of staff from the former Indiana governor to do these very types of things. And it wasn't with good intent. It was really to undermine public education and to shift public dollars to support private schools. And if you understand the history of the civil rights movement of public education, you can trace a line back to the growth of privatization and the civil rights movement in this country. So it's a really, really essential issue that organizations, first of all, they have to understand the history. They have to understand what is the ground that they're standing on. And so the fact that, just for a footnote in history, we mentioned EBF. Well, to get EBF passed, Invest in Kids was an 11th hour, 59th minute insertion into that bill to get an agreement to get that thing passed. It was a poison pill then. And the fact that Illinois was able to let that sunset, I think sets a really, really good example for other states that, yes, you can walk away from this stuff. And I'm super proud that, in my last year here of service at Maine, that I got to witness that sunset, because I'm really, really proud of that. I tried to do as much as I could to spread the word and make sure that superintendents and board members were reaching out, just as you guys did at EdRed. And who knows what was the tipping point. But I think the fact that it's sunset, that's another area where, if we stand for anything in public education, that's at the heart of it. And so the fact that we have been able to participate in watching that sunset is really great. Now, the lesson moving forward for young folks like the two of you and new board members coming on and new superintendents coming on is, this is where the education part of EdRed is so important, because not everybody really understands the history of public education and the meaning of these acts, that what the intent of them are. And I think that's an essential function of EdRed, is really continuing to educate board members, superintendents, and advocating, so that we try not to ever let this happen again, because history will definitely repeat itself. This will not be the last time that something like this is pushed in Illinois. And so it's important. To me, it's more important than ever. This is the essential function of EdRed and organizations like EdRed, is to truly protect the spirit of what public education means, certainly to improve it. Public education is not immune to criticism, and we should be open to criticism and open to suggestions about how to improve ourselves. But at the same time, public education is essential to a thriving and functioning democracy. And more than ever in my lifetime, it couldn't be more crystal clear just how important it is to really, really protect that as an institution.
One of the books that I picked up once the Invest in Kids program came on my radar was A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door by Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider. And I know they're coming out with a new version. They're, updating it, but I thought that book gave a really good overall view of the issue. To your point, the history and the trends we have seen over the past few decades towards this push for privatization. So got to plug that book, because I found that really helpful in giving this issue a lot of context. Let's go ahead and move on. Specifically in terms of our membership, in your opinion, why is EdRed an organization that gives members value? Why did your district continue to be a member? Obviously, you're our fiscal agent, you were a founding member, but what is some of the reasons that you kept coming back as a member? What were those benefits?
I think, you're either in the arena or you're not. And public education in any state is subject to be the playground for legislators. And I think for all kinds of reasons, most of the reasons that anybody tries to pass laws in education, most of the time it's with really, really, good intent. We've seen recently some intent that I think is less good, but most of the time it's for really good reasons. The problem is that in Illinois, the mandates that happen start a stack this big, and then they're this big, and then they're this big, and pretty soon they're this big, and people have visually demonstrated that over time. Many of those mandates are unfunded. And so trying to make sure that and this is in our founding documents, that legislators are well informed, that they're educated, that they hear from their communities about impacts of legislation that might be considered. And that's sort of reactive work. The other side of the equation, and I think this is where we've gotten better as an organization, is being a little bit more upstream, being a little bit more proactive. Instead of just fighting against everything, what are things that we can do to advocate for some new things? And I think that's where I see sort of the next evolution of EdRed and organizations like EdRed, because I think there are a lot of improvements that need to happen that maybe people aren't thinking about, and that we can continue to work on those things. There's certainly existing rules and legislation that need some cleanup, that needs some rethinking, and none of the work that we do in education or in life is ever chiseled in stone. It needs to always be in progress and in process. And we can't, get fixed on the idea that we ever necessarily write something today that's perfect. And so part of it is just not just an advocacy organization, but truly a learning organization that takes the research part of our mission seriously, which is tell us what the data says. And I know, right now, for example, you guys are collecting data on newcomers, which many of our districts have many, many students. The range of countries, I was just looking at ours that our kids are coming from, always have it at a district like Maine, but the range of countries, it's really amazing. And it's a piece of the work. First of all, it's a privilege, but it's a piece of the work that many of the EdRed districts do that really is unique from a lot of the rest of the country, where there might be a few newcomers to the country come in, but not to the volume and the range that come into our districts. And it adds to the complexity of what we do. So it's a variable that if you're not really paying attention to it, any movement on requiring this language or that language or language at all really, really ignores just how complex the work that we already do is and how challenging it is from a getting staff to be able to do it.
So kind of going off of that, kind of talked about and hinted at this when discussing investing kids and how you let us know what your thoughts were. The board is always our resigning board to let us know what we should pursue. In the past few years, as we know, EdRed has undergone transitions from our executive director to changes within the executive board. This last year, we had 6 new executive board members. That's a big transition.
Yeah.
What is your recommendation for the organization as we continue to move forward?
I think, part of it is even the history documents that I shared with you guys. I think this is an area when I looked at those, I was a little embarrassed myself that I hadn't looked at those previously. So I knew a lot about the history of the organization, but that really crystallized a lot. I think the education piece of the mission is one, because I think Arabette and Bridget, in your capacities, hopefully you're both, with the organization for a long, long time. So you look at what are those consistent variables. And in your positions, really, you guys, and Bridget, I'm really happy that you're reading that book, because it's books like that really give you the broader sense in both of your roles. You guys being subject matter experts on this is really, really important. We assume that people in education know all this stuff, but they don't always. And those of us that do know certainly need to make sure that we're willing to speak up and take a stand on things and advocate. But in any event, I think the continued education of, even though I know that is political, and books that we're talking about, some would consider them, political, but I think you can make a fact-based, evidence-based historical case for certain positions on this and reasons why something like Invest in Kids should have sunsetted and frankly never should have been inserted in the first place. But I think that's an important thing. Public education is and has been under attack in the last decade, 15 years even, in ways that it never was. Now, the blueprint and the game plans for this are 40 plus years in the making, but we've seen it catalyze in the last decade or more. And you can look at the Midwest footprint to really get your case studies, but it's spread. And it's related to, right to work movements and things like that, which is a really impressive euphemism if it meant what it said, but it really, really doesn't. And so I think it's important that the education component in public education be really rock solid, that there be strong level of education now and in the future to continue to improve, because if people aren't informed by the history and by the education, it's really, really easy for you to lose, sort of the movement and the shared understanding of what it is we're about anyway. It's one thing if an unfunded mandate comes in and it's, well, we're trying to kill that bill. I mean, those things are always going to happen. But on the larger issue of protecting and advancing public education, I think Illinois is positioned in an important way that is increasingly standing alone in states in this country. And that is to be an absolute true leader in public education. Our outcomes are really, really good for having the size and the diversity of a state that we have. Our outcomes are among the very best in the country. And the reason those outcomes are among the best is because we still hold to what it means to be a true public education system. We have things we can improve. There's no doubt about that. But that's the pursuit that we should be on, not to undo public education, but to improve public education in a way that is fair, that is equitable, that serves each child to the very best of our ability. And that is a mission that never goes away. It's the core. It's been the central mission of my lifetime, and it's going to continue to be. And organizations like EdRed, understanding that mission, having the passion around that mission, the drive around that mission, it's absolutely essential. We're really blessed to have, I know a lot of the folks who came on new to the board, and they're tremendous. And I know with, the two of you, your leadership, you're going to help coach them up anywhere they need to be coached up. And so I have good faith that EdRed is going to be well served in the future. But a lot of this work, we carry the torch and we pass the torch on. And that's the way the work is. That's an essential role in this work, because as we are getting ready to stop our work, it's really, really important that we have built capacity in others coming up behind us to carry that torch forward. And that's a responsibility of leadership. That really is. It's a real responsibility of leadership that we be mindful, not just of the journey that we've been on, but the journey ahead of us. And even if we won't be on that journey, others will. And so it's preparing others for that journey that is absolutely essential. And that's what an organization like EdRed really has to be all about. I know I'm on a little bit of a soapbox here today, but that really is how I see the work. And I would argue that those folks in those founding documents felt that same way too. You could see that, there was a high level of a sense of shared responsibility for making sure that we advance public education.
Yeah, not much changes over 50 years. It's really interesting. And you're here for your soapbox. This is the platform for it.
Yeah.
So you've touched on a few of the different challenges and things to focus on. When it comes to advocacy, which at the core of EdRed is what we do, what are the challenges that you have experienced and continue to see in being effective advocates? Whether that's at the legislative level or if that's in the local control level, what are some of those challenges that you've seen?
Well, first of all, one of the challenges, and I mentioned it before, in a state like Illinois, is that you have so much noise coming at you, which is if you've got 100 legislators, 70 of them want to get a bill passed. They have 70 different ideas, and it's like, you're herding cats a little bit. And so there's just there is a incoherence built into the system that really it causes a lot of legislative fatigue. And I've witnessed that firsthand where at the end of, months and months and months of negotiating behind the scenes, people just get tired. And that's a really difficult situation to be in. That's why actually, as I've witnessed us do a better job of partnering with other organizations where we can sort of share the load on this work, I think that has been a real advantage for us to get better together with other groups. And I think there's still room to continue to improve in that. I'd like to see, the Alliance do a better job of working with the other advocacy groups. We kind of sometimes do that well, but I think there's room to grow and improve in that space, because that then just increases the footprint. And so I think just the sheer amount of volume is difficult. And the other thing too is, you have a lot of turnover in the legislature. You've got a lot of turnover in those bodies, and the need to continue to interface across the state at the local level with those new folks coming in and make sure that they are educated before they start making decisions about or recommendations for things. And you're dealing with politicians. And so their frame of reference for what's important to them, and again, this is the nature of politics, but what's important to them may not necessarily always be in the best interest of public education writ large. And so I think the education piece of that is really, really important. Maybe bigger picture, and you've heard me say this, make a new rule for every new rule. We have to get rid of two, but that's a kind of pie in the sky idea. Everybody always agrees, yeah, there's too many mandates, but we still haven't kind of got that true mandate relief done yet. I think that's a place where pursuing in the future, if we could really do that, that would be good, especially if we could then create a foundation upon which legislation in the future gets filtered a little bit better than it currently gets filtered. And again, we've got wonderful, wonderful folks in the House and Senate in Illinois. We've been blessed to have really great leadership. Tony Sanders, a very good friend of mine, is the new state superintendent. And, we've got a lot of things in Illinois that other states in this nation would give their eye teeth for. We just had our North Cook meeting last week. We hosted it at Maine East, and Brent Clark was there, and he was talking about meetings that he's in where he's with similar folks around the country and just how defeated they are with the things that have happened in their states around public education, which is why, above anything else, and I know I'm a broken record on this, but it's why organizations like EdRed are so fundamentally essential. We can never take for granted in Illinois that the things that we enjoy in public education that we will always have. We always have to be advocating and staying in the arena and making sure that we protect public education. I'm convinced, frankly, that if not, but for organizations like EdRed, we might have seen some of these things happen that we've seen happen in other states. Certainly, we had a recent governor that, if he could have erased all things around Illinois public education and rewritten them to look like some of the other states, that actually would have happened. That's a really dangerous thing. I know very, very well what that looks like in those states, and it isn't good for public education, and it isn't good for kids. What it does is it really creates a bigger divide. It does not close gaps, it actually creates them. As I said earlier, it has its inception in those who were against the civil rights movement in this country. That's what really was the first driver of the movement toward privatization.
It's a good thing to have organizations like EdRed and our fellow partners. Thank you again for being our first guest on the EdRed podcast, Ken. It was actually great hearing you and talk, and you have so much of the information and institutional memory as it comes to EdRed. Any final thoughts or advice to EdRed members or legislators as it relates to public education and advocacy?
Just not to take things for granted. We're really, in all the things in life that we could do and be a part of, there's nothing more honorable or more worthy than advancing truly creating good learning conditions for human beings. There's not a better way to spend your life, in my opinion. And that's a mission, that's a calling. And most of the board members that I meet have that at their core as something they're vitally interested in. Certainly most of the folks who work in schools have that. And so continue to have the passion, to continue to have the drive never really lose that momentum. And sometimes, that happens when folks like me, I'm retiring. So we bring new people in, and finding those new people that really have that passion, have that drive, but staying involved, staying informed, staying educated, and staying committed. Having that courage to lead is vital, and it really takes committed people. But there just are very few things in any of our communities that mean more to those communities than protecting public education institutions. And so there are plenty good folks out there, and I think step up, be involved, get involved, be willing to serve, and be willing to really continue to fight for public education, because you're not just fighting for public education, you're fighting for the democracy of this country. And the two are inextricably intertwined in ways that they always have been, but more so now than ever.
Thank you so much again. Honor to have you here. You may be retiring, but we still have your information, and we'll be reaching out because you can't retire from EdRed. That's the rule. So
Okay.
thank you again. And thank you everybody for joining us for the first episode of the podcast. As hinted to, we will be joined by Brian and Bob to talk all things EBF in our next episode. So definitely tune in for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Honor